When my son said, with startling certainty, "Her house belongs to my wife," the room didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse of plates or chairs. What happened was quieter and far more revealing. Time slowed, breath tightened. And in that pause, a truth emerged that had been building for years. Arrogance rarely announces itself as cruelty. More often, it arrives dressed as confidence, modernity, or marital loyalty. It borrows language from progress, "This is how things are now," and uses it to erase history, contribution, and care. In that single sentence, my son wasn't just making a claim about property. He was rewriting a relational map. He was declaring who holds power, who is peripheral, and who no longer gets a voice. Family systems are profoundly symbolic. A house is never just a structure of walls and rooms. It is memory made solid. It is decades of labor, sacrifice, postponement, and protection. When someone claims ownership without acknowledgement of that story, what they are really saying is, your past no longer grants you authority in the present. And here is where many parents falter. Not because they agree, but because they freeze. They fear conflict. They fear being seen as outdated, intrusive, or emotional. So they go quiet, hoping dignity will speak for itself. But silence in family dynamics is rarely neutral. Silence often becomes consent. What made this moment different was not force, but interruption. My brother stepped in, not loudly, not theatrically, but with a steadiness that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. He didn't argue about legality. He didn't insult. He didn't shame. He simply reintroduced reality into a narrative that had become inflated with entitlement. And suddenly, my son froze. Because authority that is grounded does not need to dominate. It doesn't rise in pitch. It doesn't rush. It names facts without venom and values without apology. In family conflicts, this kind of intervention is deeply unsettling to arrogance, because arrogance feeds on emotional chaos. Calm clarity starves it. This moment teaches us something essential. Power in families is not only inherited, it is negotiated. Every generation renegotiates roles, boundaries, and influence. Problems arise when one generation assumes negotiation means erasure, when becoming a spouse is mistaken for becoming sovereign over all that came before. There is a quiet grief many parents carry when they realize their children no longer see them as people with history, only as resources or obstacles. This grief is rarely spoken. It hides behind phrases like, "I don't want to interfere," or "it's their life now." But withdrawal does not equal respect. And emotional abdication does not build mature families. The real educational lesson here is not about correcting a son. It is about modeling adulthood. Adulthood is not proven by asserting ownership. It is demonstrated by recognizing interdependence. Mature authority says, "I can build my future without denying your past." When my brother intervened, he did something vital. He protected the relational fabric. He reminded everyone present that family is not a hierarchy where the loudest claim wins, but a system where dignity must circulate or the structure collapses. Notice what changed in my son. It wasn't humiliation, it was disorientation. Arrogance collapses not when it is attacked, but when it is no longer mirrored. When the audience refuses to play the assigned roles of submission or outrage, the script fails. This is why boundaries matter. Not the dramatic kind that sever ties, but the quiet kind that say, "This narrative ends here." Boundaries are not punishments, they are orientations. They teach others how to locate themselves in relation to you. In many families, especially across generations, property becomes the battleground for unresolved emotional debts. Who sacrificed more? Who was absent? Who feels owed? But no legal transfer can repair emotional neglect, and no declaration of ownership can substitute for earned respect. The deeper invitation in moments like this is to ask, what kind of family culture are we rehearsing? One where power is seized, or one where it is stewarded? One where voices are overwritten, or one where they are integrated? My son froze because for the first time, the story he was telling met a boundary that was neither afraid nor aggressive. And in that stillness there was an opening, not for victory but for learning. Because families do not break from conflict, They break from the absence of truthful interruption. And sometimes the most loving act is not understanding, but standing firmly in reality and saying, "This is not how we treat each other here." Power rarely enters a room with force at first. It arrives through words. It tests the atmosphere softly, almost casually, to see what it can get away with. Long before authority is enforced through action, it is rehearsed through language. The phrases we choose, the assumptions we embed in ordinary sentences, and the confidence with which we speak about what is mine, ours, or decided, quietly shape the emotional hierarchy of a relationship. By the time power becomes visible as behavior, it has often already been normalized through speech. Consider how often entitlement hides behind grammatical certainty. Words like belongs, obviously that's how it is, or everyone knows function as shortcuts to dominance. They bypass discussion and replace it with declaration. When someone says, "This house belongs to my wife," they are not merely stating a claim about property. They are collapsing complexity into finality. They are asserting that the matter is settled, the history irrelevant, and alternative perspectives unnecessary. Language in this moment does the heavy lifting that action has not yet had to do. What makes this so powerful is that language operates beneath the radar of conflict. It feels conversational rather than confrontational. A sentence can be spoken without raised voices or visible aggression, yet still reorganize the emotional order of a room. This is how power often advances unchallenged, not by force, but by familiarity. The more a phrase is repeated, the more it sounds like truth rather than assertion. Over time, rhetoric hardens into reality simply because no one interrupted it early enough. Entitlement is especially effective when it borrows the language of legitimacy. Tradition, progress, love, or responsibility are frequently used as shields. A claim may sound reasonable because it echoes cultural norms or moral ideals. This is how families work now. Once you're married, your priorities change. "I'm just protecting my partner." Each of these statements carries emotional weight, but they can also be used to silence others. The speaker positions themselves as aligned with virtue, while dissenters are framed as outdated, selfish, or unreasonable. This is why recognizing power in language requires emotional literacy, not just logical analysis. The issue is rarely whether the statement is technically correct, but what the statement does in the relational space. Does it invite dialogue, or does it close it? Does it acknowledge multiple realities, or does it flatten them into one dominant narrative? Language that claims power prematurely tends to remove choice from others. It presents decisions as fate's accomplice rather than shared processes. In family systems, this dynamic is particularly potent because roles are already uneven. Age, gender, economic contribution, and marital status all influence who is assumed to have authority. When language reinforces these hierarchies without reflection, it can quickly become coercive. A younger family member may speak with exaggerated certainty to compensate for insecurity. A spouse may claim ownership to solidify belonging. What sounds like arrogance on the surface often masks anxiety underneath. Yet the impact remains the same. Others are diminished, regardless of intent. There is also a seductive quality to confident language. Certainty feels stabilizing, especially in moments of transition or ambiguity. When families are renegotiating roles, after marriage, inheritance discussions, or shifts in caregiving, someone who speaks decisively can feel reassuring. Others may go along simply to avoid tension or because the clarity feels preferable to confusion. This is how rhetorical power becomes socially endorsed. Silence from listeners does not always signal agreement. It often signals fatigue, fear, or a desire to preserve harmony. But silence still reinforces the claim. Over time, repeated linguistic assertions create a psychological terrain where resistance feels inappropriate. Challenging the claim starts to look like disruption rather than self-respect. The person who finally speaks up may be labeled dramatic or difficult, even though the imbalance was established quietly long before. This is why early recognition matters. The first moment a phrase subtly reassigns power is the moment where intervention is least costly and most effective. Educationally, the task is not to police language rigidly, but to cultivate awareness. Listeners must learn to ask, what assumptions are being smuggled into this sentence? Who gains authority from this wording? And who loses it? Is the speaker describing reality or attempting to create it through declaration? These questions shift us from passive reception to active participation in meaning-making. They restore agency to those who might otherwise feel overrun by confidence. It is also crucial to understand that rhetorical dominance thrives on emotional asymmetry. The speaker often sounds calm and assured, while those affected feel unsettled but struggle to articulate why. This imbalance can make the affected party doubt themselves. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this is just how things are. Self-doubt is one of language-based power's most effective outcomes. It keeps the hierarchy intact without requiring further enforcement. When unchecked, linguistic entitlement sets the stage for behavioral enforcement later. Once a claim has been normalized verbally, acting on it appears consistent rather than aggressive. Boundaries are crossed, decisions are made unilaterally, and objections are framed as afterthoughts. At that point, the conversation shifts from "should this happen?" to "why are you resisting what was already decided?" The earlier rhetorical move now justifies the later action. This progression teaches an important lesson: power is cumulative. Each unchallenged phrase becomes a brick in a structure that eventually feels immovable. By the time someone says, "this doesn't feel right," the response may be, "why didn't you say something earlier?" without acknowledging that the earlier moments were deliberately made to feel unsayable. Language, when used strategically, can close the window of objection before anyone realizes it was open. Recognizing dominance disguised as confidence also requires us to examine our cultural relationship with certainty. Many societies reward decisiveness and penalize hesitation. We admire people who know what they want and take charge. While these traits can be valuable, they become harmful when they override relational ethics. Confidence is not inherently virtuous. It must be balanced with curiosity, humility, and consent. Without these, it becomes a tool of exclusion. Tradition further complicates this dynamic. Statements rooted in how it's always been carry an authority that is difficult to question without appearing disloyal. Yet tradition itself is a narrative, sustained through repetition. When someone invokes tradition to claim power, they are leveraging collective memory to legitimize personal advantage. Educational awareness helps listeners separate respect for history from unquestioned submission to it. Honoring the past does not require surrendering agency in the present. One of the most effective counters to rhetorical entitlement is not confrontation, but clarification. Asking someone to slow down and explain what they mean by belongs or decided reopens space for dialogue. It exposes the leap between assertion and agreement. Often, the speaker has not fully examined their own language. They are repeating phrases that feel natural within their worldview. Gentle interrogation can reveal the provisional nature of what sounded absolute. Equally important is reclaiming one's own language. Responding with statements that assert presence without mirroring dominance shifts the dynamic. Phrases like, "that's not how I understand it," or "I experience this differently," resist erasure without escalating conflict. They remind the room that reality is plural. Power loses momentum when it can no longer pretend to speak for everyone. There is also an educational responsibility for those who witness these moments. Third parties play a crucial role in interrupting linguistic power grabs. When someone with relative neutrality or authority names what is happening without accusation, they legitimize resistance. A calm statement that reintroduces context or history can destabilize entitlement more effectively than emotional rebuttal. This is because rhetorical power depends on appearing uncontested. Once challenged by grounded clarity, it often falters. Ultimately, understanding how power is claimed through language teaches us that communication is never neutral. Words do not merely describe relationships, they actively shape them. Every declarative sentence carries an implicit claim about who gets to decide, whose perspective counts, and what is negotiable. Becoming fluent in this dimension of language is a form of relational maturity. It allows individuals and families to negotiate change without erasing dignity. The goal is not to eliminate confidence from speech, but to anchor it in relational accountability. True confidence can withstand questions. It does not need to rush to closure or silence others to feel secure. When language reflects shared authority rather than unilateral claim, power becomes something that circulates rather than concentrates. And in that circulation, relationships remain alive rather than coerced. By learning to hear power in words before it hardens into action, listeners gain the ability to intervene early, thoughtfully, and with integrity. They protect not only their rights, but the relational fabric itself. Because once language is allowed to dominate unchecked, action merely follows what speech has already decided. Family conflicts that appear to be about property are almost never about property. Houses, money, land, heirlooms, and inheritance papers are simply the visible surface of something far more intimate and far more fragile: the human need to be seen, to be respected, and to have one's place in the family acknowledged. When families fracture over ownership, what is really being contested is not square footage or legal title, but recognition. Who counts, who decides, and whose story is allowed to shape the present. A house, in particular, carries emotional density. It is not just a physical structure, but a repository of effort, memory, and identity. It holds the years someone worked beyond exhaustion, the sacrifices that were made quietly, the compromises that were never fully articulated. When disputes arise around such a space, they awaken old questions that were never resolved. Was my contribution valued? Was my role ever fully acknowledged? Do I still matter now that the family has moved into a new phase? In many families, especially across generations, property becomes the language through which unresolved relational tensions finally speak. Emotional needs that were ignored or postponed find expression through legal arguments and territorial claims. It is often safer to argue about who owns what than to say, "I feel erased," or "I am afraid I no longer belong." Property disputes offer a socially acceptable arena to fight for recognition without having to name vulnerability directly. This dynamic is particularly pronounced during transitions. Marriage, childbirth, aging, illness, and death all reorder family hierarchies. Roles that once felt stable suddenly become uncertain. Parents who were once central may find themselves peripheral. Adult children who once deferred may feel entitled to lead. These shifts are emotionally disorienting, and property often becomes the symbolic anchor through which new power arrangements are negotiated. The question of ownership becomes a proxy for the question of adulthood: who is now in charge? Who has earned authority? Who is still relevant? What complicates these moments is that recognition is not a finite resource, yet it is often treated as one. Family members may behave as if acknowledging one person's contribution diminishes another's. This scarcity mindset fuels competition rather than connection. A son's claim over a house may not only be about securing resources for his spouse, but about declaring independence from his parents. In asserting ownership, he is saying, "I am no longer a child. I decide now." The tragedy is that this declaration often comes at the cost of relational continuity, because it is framed as a takeover rather than a transition. Similarly, parents who resist relinquishing control may not be clinging to property so much as to identity. Letting go of decision-making power can feel like disappearing. When their authority is challenged, it may echo older wounds of being unappreciated or overlooked. The house, then, becomes a stand-in for their sense of self. To lose it without acknowledgement feels like being written out of their own story. Recognition is not just about gratitude, it is about visibility. It answers the question, do you see what I have done, and do you see who I am now? In healthy families, this visibility evolves. Contributions are named, roles are renegotiated, and authority is shared rather than seized. In less reflective families, these negotiations remain implicit, leaving room for resentment and misunderstanding. Property becomes the battleground where these silent struggles finally collide. One of the most painful aspects of these conflicts is how easily people become invisible to one another. When ownership is framed in purely legal or transactional terms, the human story behind it disappears. A parent becomes an obstacle. A sibling becomes greedy. A spouse becomes entitled. These labels flatten complex emotional realities into caricatures, making empathy nearly impossible. The fight over property then justifies relational cruelty because the other is no longer experienced as a full person with history and feelings. Educationally, reframing these conflicts requires helping people hear what is being asked beneath what is being argued. When someone insists, "This house belongs to me," the deeper question may be, "Do you respect my adulthood?" When another responds, "I built this with my own hands," they may be asking, "Do you acknowledge my sacrifices?" Until these underlying questions are addressed, no legal resolution will bring peace. Agreements may be signed, but bitterness will linger. Another crucial dimension is the role of cultural scripts. Many families operate within inherited narratives about gender, age, and obligation. In some cultures, marriage automatically elevates status. In others, elders retain authority indefinitely. These scripts shape expectations long before any conflict arises. When individuals act in alignment with these scripts, they may feel justified, even righteous. Yet scripts do not account for emotional nuance. They tell people what they are supposed to feel and do, not what they actually experience. Property conflicts often erupt when lived reality no longer fits the script. The house as a symbol also exposes the tension between continuity and change. Families want to evolve without disintegrating. They want new members to belong without erasing the old. When this balance fails, property becomes a zero-sum game. Either the past wins or the future does. But healthy family systems find ways to honor both. They create rituals of acknowledgement, explicit conversations about roles, and shared narratives that include multiple generations. Without these, the symbolic weight placed on property becomes unbearable. Recognition also intersects with dignity. How decisions are made matters as much as what decisions are made. Being consulted, informed, and respected preserves dignity even when outcomes are difficult. Being bypassed or declared irrelevant inflicts humiliation that no inheritance can repair. Many family conflicts escalate not because of loss, but because of the manner in which loss is imposed. The absence of dialogue communicates disrespect far more loudly than any material outcome. Third-party interventions often reveal this truth. When an outsider calmly reframes the conflict, naming contributions, acknowledging transitions, and clarifying boundaries, the emotional temperature drops. This is not because the property issue disappears, but because recognition is momentarily restored. People soften when they feel seen. They can tolerate loss if it does not come with erasure. Education and family dynamics must therefore emphasize the power of acknowledgement as a stabilizing force. It is also important to recognize how invisibility compounds over time. Small moments of being overlooked accumulate. A parent's advice dismissed, a sibling's effort unmentioned, a contribution taken for granted. By the time property becomes the issue, it carries the weight of years of silent injury. The intensity of the conflict often surprises those involved, but it makes sense when viewed as the eruption of long-suppressed needs for recognition. Reframing property disputes as recognition struggles does not mean ignoring practical realities. Legal clarity is important. Financial security matters. But without addressing the relational dimension, practical solutions remain brittle. They may resolve the immediate dispute while sowing seeds for future estrangement. Education in this area teaches families to separate the symbolic from the logistical, to tend to both rather than confusing one for the other. Ultimately, the house is a mirror. It reflects how a family understands belonging, authority, and continuity. When conflicts arise, they invite a deeper inquiry. Can we acknowledge each other's journeys without competing for supremacy? Can adulthood be claimed without diminishing those who came before? Can recognition circulate rather than concentrate? These are not legal questions, they are relational ones. When families learn to answer these questions with honesty and care, property loses its power to divide. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a resource, not a referendum on worth. But when recognition is withheld, even the most modest inheritance can fracture bonds beyond repair. The true work, then, is not deciding who owns the house, but ensuring that no one inside the family becomes invisible in the process. Silence in families is often misunderstood as peace. It is mistaken for maturity, patience, or self-control. Yet in many family systems, silence is not neutral at all. It is an active force that shapes behavior, reinforces hierarchies, and quietly authorizes arrogance to grow. When entitlement goes unchallenged, it does not interpret silence as restraint, it interprets it as permission. Over time, what began as a single overconfident remark becomes a pattern of dominance, simply because no one interrupted it early enough. Arrogance thrives in unmarked spaces. It expands where boundaries are absent or unclear. In families, elders often hold the greatest symbolic authority, even when they no longer hold practical power. Their silence carries weight. When an elder does not respond to disrespect, others read that quiet as endorsement, or at least as surrender. The message becomes, this behavior is acceptable here, even if no one ever said so out loud. Silence, in this way, becomes a collaborator in the very dynamics it seeks to avoid. Many elders remain silent not because they agree, but because they fear the cost of speaking. They worry about conflict, estrangement, or being labeled difficult. They may believe that love requires endurance, or that authority is best exercised through restraint. Some were raised to equate silence with dignity, others carry unresolved guilt and feel they have forfeited the right to set limits. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. The emotional hierarchy tilts toward the loudest, not the wisest. Unchecked behavior gains confidence through repetition. Each time arrogance is met with silence, it becomes bolder. The person acting out tests the boundary again, slightly further this time, watching for consequences. When none arrive, the behavior solidifies into identity. This is just how he is. She speaks her mind. What began as a choice becomes a trait, and traits are harder to challenge than behaviors. By the time the family recognizes the problem, it feels entrenched, even though it was built quietly, moment by moment. Silence also distorts reality for those on the receiving end of arrogance. Without external validation, they may begin to doubt their own perceptions. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe this is normal. This self-doubt is particularly damaging in family systems where belonging is essential. People will often sacrifice self-respect to preserve connection. Arrogance exploits this instinct. It relies on the other's fear of rupture more than on its own strength. What makes boundaries so powerful is not their volume, but their clarity. A boundary does not need to be dramatic to be effective. In fact, the most transformative interventions are often calm, precise, and emotionally regulated. They do not attack the person, they interrupt the pattern. A simple statement that names what is happening and reasserts limits can shift the entire dynamic. Arrogance expects either submission or explosion. It is disoriented by grounded presence. When someone intervenes without aggression, they reintroduce order into a system that has become skewed. Emotional hierarchies in families are not fixed, they are constantly negotiated through interaction. A calm intervention from an elder, or even a respected third party, can recalibrate roles without humiliation. It sends a message that authority does not require domination, and that respect is non-negotiable, even when love is unconditional. The effectiveness of such interventions lies in their refusal to escalate. Aggression invites defense, and defense entrenches positions. Calm boundaries, by contrast, create a pause. They slow the interaction down, forcing everyone to notice what has been normalized. This pause is often uncomfortable, especially for the person whose behavior has gone unchecked. That discomfort is not harm, it is the beginning of awareness. For the first time, their actions meet resistance that is not reactive, but reflective. In family systems, timing matters. The earlier a boundary is introduced, the less force it requires. When silence has already allowed arrogance to mature, intervention feels riskier. Elders may worry that speaking now will seem inconsistent or provoke backlash. Yet delayed boundaries are still boundaries. While they may require more steadiness, they are often met with relief by others who have been silently carrying the weight of the imbalance. Boundaries articulate what many have felt but feared to say. There is also an educational component to boundaries. They teach by example what behavior is acceptable and what is not. Children and younger family members learn how to treat others not from lectures, but from what is tolerated. When elders model calm assertiveness, they pass down a template for respectful disagreement. When they model silence in the face of disrespect, they inadvertently teach avoidance or submission. In this way, silence does not just sustain arrogance in the present, it seeds it in the future. A grounded intervention does not seek to win, it seeks to restore balance. Its goal is not to punish the arrogant person, but to protect the relational space. This distinction is crucial. Punitive responses may temporarily suppress behavior, but they rarely change it. Restorative boundaries, however, clarify expectations and consequences without attacking identity. They allow the person to adjust without losing face, which increases the likelihood of genuine change. It is important to acknowledge that setting boundaries in families can activate deep emotional currents. For elders, it may stir grief about aging, loss of authority, or unfulfilled expectations. For younger members, it may trigger shame, anger, or fear of inadequacy. A calm intervention holds these emotions without being governed by them. It recognizes that discomfort is not a sign of failure, but of growth. Families that can tolerate this discomfort evolve. Those that cannot remain stuck in cycles of resentment and withdrawal. Silence often masquerades as sacrifice. I keep quiet for the sake of the family. While well-intentioned, this belief overlooks the long-term cost of unspoken limits. Sacrifice without acknowledgement breeds resentment, and resentment eventually leaks out in ways that are far more damaging than early, honest boundaries. Calm interventions prevent this accumulation. They allow issues to be addressed while they are still manageable, rather than erupting after years of suppression. There is also a moral clarity in boundaries that silence lacks. Silence leaves interpretation open. Boundaries state values. They say, "This matters here." They define the culture of the family. Without them, the culture defaults to the preferences of the most dominant personality. With them, the culture becomes intentional. Everyone knows where the lines are, and this predictability actually increases safety, even if it initially feels restrictive. One of the greatest myths about boundaries is that they destroy closeness. In reality, the opposite is often true. Boundaries make closeness sustainable. They prevent the erosion of respect that eventually poisons affection. When people know what is expected and what will not be tolerated, they can relax. They no longer have to guess, endure, or strategize. Arrogance loses its stage when boundaries define the script. Ultimately, silence and boundaries are both powerful, but they operate in opposite directions. Silence diffuses responsibility and concentrates power in the hands of the boldest. Boundaries distribute responsibility and return power to the system as a whole. In families where emotional bonds amplify every interaction, choosing boundaries over silence is an act of care.